Welcome to today's discussion. My name is Glenn Diesen. With me is the excellent Alexander Mercouris. I'm also joined today from Iran by Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, I guess Iran often falls in this category of countries of which many people seem to have a very strong opinion about, even though many tend to know very little about that country and its position. So, I would say often we see the media lean on their emotional slogans and catchphrases, which makes it very difficult to get an informed view on Iran's positions and perspectives on key issues. Which is why, again, we have the privilege to speak with Professor Marandi today. And as a prominent professor in Iran and also an advisor to the Iranian nuclear negotiations team in Vienna, I think, he would be in an excellent position to make us all a bit wiser. So the topics we really wanted to address today is everything from Iran's efforts to improve relations with the Gulf states, a strategic partnership, an economic partnership with China and Russia, the tensions with the United States. But I guess, my first question to you is about the economic integration of this, massive Asian or Eurasian continent, which somewhat ties all of these topics together, because there seems to be a desire to decentralize the international economic system among all these countries on this continent to reduce dependence on the Western economies. Of course, this is to enhance prosperity, but also to prevent countries like the United States to use economic dependence as a weapon to preserve its dominant position in the international system. So, and I feel like Iran often takes a key role in all of this because we see these huge initiatives from BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We have the Eurasian Economic Union, which is signing free trade with Iran. We have the International North-South Transportation Corridor, again, Iran being there at the center. We see tech partnerships, energy, new transportation corridors, currency swaps, new payment systems. So I was just wondering first, on your perspective, do you see this economic integration as a key influence, something that's driving Iran's policies and vision for the future? And also, what do you see the role of Iran being in this wider transformation of the Eurasian space?
You're absolutely correct. The events that we're seeing today, the economic integration that is gradually taking place across Asia is profound. It has been going on for a while. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has been pursued for a decade now. The whole idea came from an article written by Professor Wang Jisoo at Beijing University. I think it translates in English "marching westward" or "marching west," where when after Obama spoke of pivoting to Asia, he wrote this article that China should pivot to the West, meaning Central Asian. After that, the Belt and Road Initiative became Chinese government policy. And now, especially, I think, after the war in Ukraine, many of these changes have been taking place at a much more rapid pace. In the past, Iran was, of course, sanctioned. It was very difficult for Iran, and it was very difficult to convince countries like China or Russia and others to break away from the Western financial institutions, because, of course, Iran is not a huge economic player. It was important, it continues to be important, but it wasn't an economic powerhouse. So the incentive for China and others to do something that could anger the Americans was limited. So countries would cooperate with Iran, but they would be very careful. Even the Belt and Road Initiative that China was pursuing it when it came to Iran, even though Iran was a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, less work was done because the Chinese were cautious. But I believe that after the war in Ukraine began, things changed much more rapidly. First of all, we had a new administration in Tehran. President Raisi is different from the previous president, President Rouhani. President Rouhani, I would argue, looked more to the West. I wouldn't say President Raisi looks to the East, but I think President Raisi looks to a policy of Asian integration. And so the war in Ukraine coincided with this new administration in Tehran coming to power. I was in Vienna, of course, during the negotiations when the war began. And I think even then, I could see how things were changing when I was having discussions with certain colleagues from Europe or journalists in Europe. You could already see how the future would be very different from the past. So after the war in Ukraine began, Russia changed. The situation in Russia changed dramatically. Russia became, like Iran, sanctioned, and it turned to Iran for help with regards to dealing with sanctions. But also, as you pointed out, the development of the north-south corridor between Iran and Russia became much more important, and much more a sense of urgency uh, existed with regards to its development, because Russia wanted to have alternative routes for trade. It both wanted to be able to trade with Iran, but also through Iran, trade in the Persian Gulf, and then use the Persian Gulf and to trade with India, Africa, and Chinese ports, and other countries across the world. And of course, the North-South corridor provided Iran with an opportunity to have access to Russia uh, and the North Caucasus and Central Asia. So integration between Iran and Russia, economic integration and greater military and political cooperation uh, grew very fast. Simultaneously, I would argue that the Chinese felt that now that it was both Iran and Russia, they needed to rethink many of their policies, because after Iran and Russia, it would be China that's targeted. And China was, of course, being targeted by the United States, especially during the Trump years. During Obama, it began, but during the Trump years, the economic warfare between the two countries expanded. So China began to change its policies towards both Iran and Russia. And that increased the pace of integration. The Belt and Road Initiative uh, became more important, the Iran-Chinese relationship, the Iran-Russian relationship. So for Iran, suddenly these connections, connecting North and South, East and West through Iran became a priority for the current administration. And right now, the government is developing the roads and rails and the shipping at a much faster pace than before. Also, I think after the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza uh, enhanced these relationships. I've been to Russia a couple of times over the past couple of months, and I've been to China a couple of times as well. And you can see that the mood is changed even further when it comes to the situation in Gaza. So there's much more cooperation and coordination between Iran and Russia, and Iran and China, and Russia and China. And of course, I think the Russians and the Chinese appreciate the fact that Iran has a very large sphere of influence. It has allies in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. And in Afghanistan, it has significant influence. And of course, the Persian Gulf is is right beside Iran, and that is where much of the world's energy comes from. So uh, you are absolutely correct. I think that this integration is speeding up, and we saw it when Iran became a part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It was manifested there, and again more recently when Iran joined BRICS. I think again it showed that these countries, the core or the countries that set up BRICS, that they appreciated the role that Iran plays and that the role that Iran can play in future. So I think that it's very fair to say that while Asian integration or South-South cooperation has been uh, increasingly discussed over the past couple of decades, but I think it's really US policy that has pushed things in this direction so fast. The events that we've seen over the past couple of years have brought about dramatic change. And Iran has benefited a lot from this. Of course, it's sad to say that in a way, because the war in Ukraine is a tragedy and the events in Gaza are heartbreaking. But that aside, the tide has turned and the Iranians have broken out of isolation. Relations with regional countries have improved significantly, especially with Saudi Arabia. And the Iranians and the Saudis were negotiating for 3 years to reestablish ties, but there was always a sticking point when the Chinese were asked by the Saudis to mediate, and the Iranians subsequently accepted. The two sides spoke in Beijing, and the Saudis put aside that precondition, and ties were restored. So now Iran's relations with countries across Asia have improved significantly, but also in West Asia, the tensions have decreased. So I would say that a lot of this is due to US policy, due to European policy, due to Israeli policies, and that they have actually brought countries closer to one another, countries that they would have rather kept apart.
Mm. If I could ask about a little bit about the mood in amongst policymakers and about people in Iran, because as we've previously discussed on other occasions, I mean, Iran is witnessing this year an extraordinary change, almost a year of miracles. You've talked about the rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, which I think still took an awful lot of people by surprise. We've had this close convergence with the Russians. We've had a big arms deal with the Russians of a kind that the Russians, I can remember Alexander Fomin, the deputy defense minister of Russia, reassuring the Israelis that an arms deal of this nature between Russia and Iran would never happen. And yet here we see it, it has happened. China's developing its relations. You now have, I believe, a free trade agreement coming up with the Russians, coming up for signature in a few weeks. And of course, the Chinese and the Russians are closely integrated with each other. And this in a country that must have felt itself very much a fortress under siege, going all the way back to 1979. You've had a prolonged and very difficult war in the 1980s and with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. You've had to worry about what might be happening in Iraq. You've had all the various threats of attacks from Israel, from the United States that have happened on many occasions. And you've had a concerted policy of economic strangulation, if you like. Do people in Iran generally understand how completely the situation has suddenly changed for Iran? And what do people, if you have any contact with them, people in government feel? Do they suddenly see opportunities, diplomatic opportunities specifically, opening up for Iran, which never existed before?
Yes, I think that people do, in general, feel that the walls surrounding Iran are cracking and collapsing, and they the joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was symbolic of that. Joining BRICS was also symbolic, perhaps even more significant. Uh, the symbolism there, but also I think that people see in general how countries in the region and major powers across the globe are speaking with the Iranians. They're more keen on cooperating with the Iranians. There are signs of economic growth in the country that didn't exist for the past few years. The last 2 quarters, the country has experienced high economic growth. But at the same time, life is still difficult for most ordinary Iranians. The sanctions over the last decade have made life much more difficult than before. Although I think that if someone from outside comes to Iran or visits Tehran or any other city, they would be very surprised uh, by how by the fact that it's uh, very developed, that it's very modern. But when you live in Tehran and you, as a government employee or uh, ordinary people, for many, it's difficult to make ends meet, largely due to the sanctions. So we're still not, or I think most people still are not seeing the benefits of the current situation. But if it continues, I think that within a year or two, things will begin to become easier for people. And we are already seeing investors coming in from China and Russia into the country, but in particular China, who are keen on investing in the country. So there are these changes taking place. I think that government officials do appreciate what is going on because they are more deeply involved on a day-to-day basis with the changes that are taking place across the region. And one other important thing that I should add is that the West, and I mean Western governments, have they have been working very hard to undermine Iran for decades, as you've alluded to. Um, they have a huge media apparatus in Persian, many TV channels, many Telegram channels. They have many thousands of people who are working on Iran, just in media and working against Iran. You have more Persian media outlets that are based outside the country and are hostile to the state than you have inside the country. You know, BBC, VOA, Iran International. There are many, and then, as I said, there are many online platforms as well. And there's also a cyber army that is where thousands of people are working in Albania 24 hours a day against Iran, and the list goes on. You have terrorist organizations such as the MEK and the monarchists and certain Kurdish groups funded by the West alongside Iran's borders with Iraq or alongside the no man's land in Pakistan near the Iranian border that are constantly either carrying out terror attacks or trying to create unrest inside the country. So, and I think it is unique. Russia and China don't have this huge anti-Russian or anti-Chinese media apparatus, not because they're not as important, but it's with Iran, it started a long time ago. The antagonism towards Russia is more recent. It is, I mean, it is huge now, but 10 years with Iran, this began 20, 30 years ago. And now I think that it's beginning to decrease the funding because one of the key TV channels that's anti-Iran is shutting down. So I think they're probably redirecting funding towards bigger fish. But in any case, this onslaught, this psychological warfare against Iranians has been going on for many years. So on the one hand, they strangle Iranians through sanctions. They threaten Iranians with military attacks. All options are on the table. And then you have this constant media attack on Iranians, where people are told day and night how miserable they are, how this is the worst country in the world, so this has been going on for a very long time. And there is a class of Iranians, let's say a pro-Western liberal class, that have been influenced by the West and influenced by this media. I have some of my students, some colleagues at university, they're very hostile or very critical of the state. I mean, the state institutions, and often very pro-West. And because they've been under the influence of these media outlets, and also the problems that exist in Iran, incompetence, corruption, just like everywhere else, but largely because of the influence of this Western media. But as a result of the war in Gaza and the role that Western countries have been playing in this genocide and blocking a ceasefire or aiding the Israeli regime, the West has really destroyed its image among that class of Iranians that they were always counting on. So the on the one hand, I think it's fair to say that these walls surrounding Iran are crumbling slowly or gradually. But on the other hand, I think that the damage that the West has done to itself in the eyes of Iranians, and I'm sure this is not just true about Iranians, I think this is true about across the globe. Whenever, let me give you a good example. Whenever the Iranians and the Chinese, or the Iranians and the Russians, want to agree on something, you have this huge online assault on that agreement, on the meeting between the two presidents, whether it's Iran and China or Iran and Russia, as examples, and how this is, this is going to hurt Iranian interests. This is terrible. Russia is the enemy. China is the enemy. And so you have a segment of Iranians, and then, for example, they say the Russians are doing this in Ukraine and the Chinese are doing that to their Muslims. But now, regardless of whether any of that is true or not, but now people are seeing day and night what's going on in Gaza. So U.S. soft power has been, in my opinion, demolished. And I think that is something that is not easy to put a number on, or let's say to calculate its significance. But I think it is going to create great harm to American interests in the months and years ahead across the globe, and in particular in our region, because I'm absolutely certain that this is not unique to ordinary Iranians. When I was in China just last week, I was invited for a conference. I went to 3 different cities. And in all my conversations, the Chinese were saying, before Gaza, people in China, those who were interested in our region, it was sort of 50-50. Some sympathize with the Israelis, some sympathize with the Palestinians. But that has all changed. People are overwhelmingly pro-Palestine. In my trips to Russia, the two of you know Russia as well as I, if not much better. The mood across among those who I speak with in Russia and I communicate with in Russia and I meet in Russia has changed significantly as well. So this is not just about Israel. This is about the collective West. So what Israel does in Gaza reflects upon Berlin, it reflects upon Paris, it reflects upon London, but most importantly, it reflects upon Washington.
I think you can put some figures on this, and that is by looking at the voting in the General Assembly, which is about the international situation. So we had a General Assembly resolution on the 26th of October calling for a humanitarian pause leading to a sustained end cessation of hostilities. Complex use of language. On the 26th of October, it attracted the support of 121 states. And 2 days ago, we had another stronger General Assembly resolution, which calls for a humanitarian ceasefire it used the word ceasefire, and it attracted the support of 153 states. So the number of states is growing, and the language of the resolutions is hardening. And I think that is happening every day. That trend is happening every day. And I don't know whether this is true. And I want to make it clear that I really don't know if this is true. But somebody who is well informed has told me that opinion polling in Russia is showing such strong sympathy for Palestine that the Kremlin itself is been telling the polling agencies, don't publish this because it's going to make problems for us with the Israelis. And one thing I can say is that Putin has spoken to Netanyahu on 2 occasions since the conflict began in Gaza. And both of those calls, but especially the last one, if you compare the readouts, the Russian and the Israeli ones, were becoming very tense and very difficult indeed. And go back a few years, it's not so long ago that I can remember Netanyahu invited to Moscow, attending the Victory Day parade on the 9th of May as the guest of honor. So you can see the huge shift that's happening in attitudes there. So I just wanted to just add those points. You can actually see illustrations to this things. You can, up to a certain point, you can measure them, perhaps numerically in some respects, and certainly mood-wise as well. So can I just ask about Iran and its economic, well, before I do that, actually, security situation is still difficult for Iran. You have a USS Navy carrier, as I understand. The Eisenhower is now in the Persian Gulf. There's said to be another submarine lurking around somewhere with lots and lots of cruise missiles. What is the mood about this in Iran? Are people worried that this might result in some kind of an attack on Iran? Is this a fear that people still have? Do the government people, do they see these actually very substantial American military deployments in the Middle East? Do they worry about them? There's reports that there's been fighting in Iraq, in American bases, and in Syria, and there's all sorts of confusing information about what's going on in the Red Sea. What do people in Iran feel about this? I mean, government people, people generally.
We've been threatened by the Americans for decades now. We have seen the Americans, different American presidents and secretaries of state or defense secretaries use the phrase all options are on the table many times. But I think as we've moved forward, Iran has grown stronger, especially militarily. I think Russians would agree that Iran's military technology and capabilities are very significant, and the United States, because of these never-ending wars, is not the United States of 30 years ago. In fact, I would argue, and this is just an opinion, that the biggest tragedy for the American people was actually the victory over Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. Because, in my opinion, the ghosts of Vietnam made the United States a more cautious country. And after, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also this tremendous victory in Kuwait, which really wasn't all that important because Saddam didn't fight. I mean, we could discuss that in detail some other time. But what appeared to be a big victory, I think, sort of did away with the ghost of Vietnam and made America, the United States, very confident about its capabilities. And probably that had something to do with all these wars that we've been seeing, whether in Yugoslavia or in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and elsewhere, or the dirty wars that we've seen like in Syria or Yemen and so on. But I think now the United States is not seen by ordinary Iranians as some imminent threat. In fact, U.S. assets in the Persian Gulf are very vulnerable. If the United States really was serious about targeting Iran, the first thing that they would do is that they would remove the aircraft carrier from the Persian Gulf, because this is like the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s technology with the sort of missile technologies that we see today. The nature of war has changed, and naval ships in the as they used to, the role that they used to play traditionally, I think their role now is very different from the past. So I don't think that American ships in the Persian Gulf really they mean anything, except for perhaps the opposite. They probably mean that nothing is going to happen. Otherwise, they'd have to move all of those ships outside of Iranian missile range, which would be all the way to the Red Sea. And then, of course, you have Yemen in the Red Sea. So that still makes things very difficult for the Americans. So I don't think anyone in Iran feels that any war is imminent. Iran doesn't want a war in the region. No one does. But the Iranians and their allies they'll support the Palestinians. And something that I should like to point out here is that something that I've been saying for many years, but I think many in the West, at least among mainstream Western politicians and mainstream Western journalists, they fail to appreciate, is that Iran has powerful allies across the region. And I'm sure that is a part of the American calculation when they refrain from striking Iran. So Iran is both powerful at home, but it has powerful allies. But I have to stress that these are allies. You often hear how the Ansarullah, or what the Americans and the Europeans call the Houthis, how they're in Yemen, these people in Yemen are Iranian proxies, or that Hezbollah is in the Iranian proxy, or that the Hashid or the resistance groups in Iraq, they're Iranian proxies, or Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they're Iranian proxies. That I don't believe to be the case at all. And I think that is one reason why Iran is so powerful. The United States and many of its friends in the region, they do have a history of using proxies. But in the case of Iran, these are close relationships. These are allies. Iran doesn't tell Sana'a what to do. It doesn't tell Hezbollah in Lebanon what to do. It doesn't tell its allies in Iraq what to do. And that's why I think the Americans made a major miscalculation when they thought that by sanctioning Iran, the resistance across the region would collapse because they would have a shortage of funding. I think they really misunderstood the nature of the relationship. First of all, the amount of money spent in the region is really almost nothing compared to the amount of money that the United States and its allies spend. But more importantly, is the fact that there's a bond that exists between these groups and organizations, and in the case of Yemen, it's effectively a government that brings them close together. And therefore, you see that, for example, Sana'a, or Yemen, is actively fighting alongside the Gazans, or Hezbollah is fighting in the north to keep part of the Israeli army in the north so that they cannot be used in Gaza. So this is a sort of, I would say, a bond that exists. These are allies and not proxies. If they were proxies, I think the Americans would have had it wouldn't have been very difficult for the Americans to tear this network apart.
Sorry. No, I just want to ask quickly on the relationship between the evolving relationship between Iran and Russia, because I guess unlike Iran and China, the history of Russia and Iran has been burdened with more problems in its path, mutual conflicts. But you also mentioned before, after America said it would pivot to Asia to contain China, that's when the Chinese began to march west. But the year after, in 2014, when the West supported the coup in Ukraine, that's effectively when the Russians began to march east. They decided then that Europe didn't work anymore, that they had to connect their economy closer with Asia instead. So similar ideas as what the Chinese had, and of course, I see similar ideas, of course, being prevalent in Iran. That modernization and economy can't depend on the West, obviously, given the history of sanctions. But for the Russians, this meant when they started to look east instead of west, that suddenly the relationship with Iran had a very different role. Suddenly, it's not something you can trade away. It became, a key core or a pillar of this greater Eurasian partnership they had envisioned, because you can't build greater Eurasia without Iran. So suddenly they went from being, almost peripheral to being one of its main partners. So when they intervened in Syria to prevent the regime change there, then of course they partnered up with Iran, and this had a limited purpose. And I remember in Moscow, many people were speaking about how the objective should be to convert this very limited cooperation in Syria with Iran to something wider, something more strategic, encompass a wider area of interest, to make sure that interests are harmonized and deal with the areas where they do not harmonize. But I was just wondering, I kind of seen it from the Russian perspective. I was just wondering, what is the views in Iran? Is this still a relation with Russia? Is it still something that's a bit divisive in society, among government? Is there some worry about too much economic dependence on the Russians, the military cooperation? Is this what are the thoughts around these topics?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. Iran and Russia do have a history, and there has always been sensitivity towards or with regards to the Iran-Russian relationship, and that Western media apparatus that I was speaking about earlier puts a lot of focus on this. It constantly reminds people about Russia's role in the past in Iran. Of course, it's ironic that most of these media outlets are based in London, and the British, their activities in Iran were not exactly benign. And they are right now among, these are the countries that are sanctioning Iran. But still, they do constantly try to play upon these fault lines and to create as much division as possible and to impede progress in the relationship between Iran and Russia. And I would say that the Iranians and the Russians have a long way to go still to create greater understanding between the two peoples. We don't have, for example, a Russian TV channel in Iran that is directed towards a Russian-speaking audience. The Russians don't have a Persian language TV network that explains Russia to Iranians, whereas the BBC, VOA, and Deutsche Welle, the French, they all have, as I said, they spend a lot of resources on this. So there's a lot that the two have to do, and also they have to be careful about the past and how to deal with that history that existed. But I think you're also absolutely correct that things I think changed in phases. I think the collapse of the Soviet Union changed the nature of the relationship because the Soviet Union was always seen as a threat. It was our borders to the north. It was the Soviet Union, what is now Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Caspian, of course, and Turkmenistan. This was all the Soviet Union. So our neighbor to the north was the Soviet Union and no one else. When the Soviet Union collapsed, I think that sense of fear or concern that existed, it was swept away. And the relationship began to grow but very slowly because Russia itself was in crisis. And then when Russia began to rebuild itself, especially over the last couple of decades, I think its focus was largely on the West. And the same is true, I think, with Iran. The Iranians were still, we were still in a different world back then. The Iranians were trying to rebuild or, try to preserve their relations with the West. And the focus wasn't on bilateral relations. In fact, the North-South transport corridor, which is becoming very important now to both President Putin and President Raisi, and they speak regularly on the phone. They speak every few, 3-4 weeks with each other on the phone, and they meet regularly as well. A lot of the conversation, a lot of the discussion is about the North-South corridor. But this was actually something that the two sides agreed upon a long time ago, but it wasn't really pursued. I'm not sure if it's mostly the fault of Iran or Russia. I think it's probably Iran's fault more than Russia's. But I think it wasn't a priority anyway back then. But still, Russia no longer had that image that existed with regards to the Soviet Union. Then in Syria, when the Russians decided to join, and General Soleimani went to Moscow, and President Putin agreed to send military forces to Syria, and especially the Russian Air Force, which played a big role. That was very important for Iran because Iran would have lost a lot more lives if it wasn't for the Russian Air Force. The Russian Air Force played a great role in defeating ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and Iran was mostly on the ground. And, so if it wasn't for the Russian Air Force, I think we would have had a lot more people sacrificed to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But more importantly, in the long run, is the fact that the two armed forces began to mingle. They began to know each other better. They began to cooperate with each other. They'd help each other. They'd save each other, their soldiers under circumstances. So that pushed things forward. But I think the biggest push by far, the biggest change was the war in Ukraine, and Russia refocusing its relationships altogether, because the West was now a dead end, and the Russians had to rethink. And also it made sense. It made sense for the North-South transport corridor, for example. Whether Russian relations with Europe or the United States were normal or not, it made sense to create this alternative route, but it wasn't a priority because I think traditionally people viewed the world in Eurocentric terms. So they didn't see the importance of having the Belt and Road or the North-South transport corridor back then as much as they do now. So often something that's really, it's right in front of your eyes and you should see it, you often are blind to it. And then when circumstances change, you suddenly realize that you have some huge potential in front of you that you never really explored or noticed before.
Can I just add a little historical context to some of the points made, which is that, of course, talking about Iranian relations with Russia, the problems in them, it might just be worth pointing out to some of our viewers that in 1907, Iran was actually divided into spheres of influence by the British and the Russians. They actually, said, this is country where Russians are going to have the north and the British will have the south. So, and there's been many wars before that in the 18th and 19th century between Iran and Russia. And at the time of the Tehran Conference in 1943, of course, there were Soviet troops and British troops in Tehran. So, there is a very long and very complex relationship between Iran.
So, for example, there's a very famous photo of the President of the United States, the President of Russia, and the Prime Minister of England during the Second World War, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in Tehran. But when they came to Tehran, they ignored the Shah of Iran. He wasn't even invited to the meeting or even invited to have a photo opportunity with them. Yeah. So Iran was never a colony
No.
like many other countries. But Iran had some very low points in history, and those years, that era, the early 19th century, the mid 19th century, these were times when Iran was foreign influence was huge, and as you rightly point out, the North was under Russian occupation, and the South basically under British occupation. So that history exists, but it's interesting how the British and the West play on these historical facts to try to divide Iran and Russia in Iran through their Persian media, but they somehow don't seem to take note of the fact that they were very much a part of it, if not much more than the Russians. And as I said earlier, today it's not the Russians who are sanctioning Iran; it's these Western countries.
Can I ask about Iran's relations with Central Asia? Because, of course, Iran has a huge history in Central Asia. I mean, it's perhaps not something that the Uzbek government wants to acknowledge, but Samarkand, for example, I know people from there. They tell me that the language that people speak there is Persian, for example. And Afghanistan, again, it's very much part of the Persian sphere. We don't hear we think of Iran very much being involved in the Middle East, in the Arabian Peninsula, in the events in Palestine, in Syria. But of course, it's a very strategically located place because you've got Central Asia to the north, you've got the Caucasus, you've got Turkey, you've got Afghanistan. Turkey has been trying to make big moves in Central Asia. Now that this relationship with Russia has been to a great extent resolved, will Iran be looking to develop some of its historic relationships with the Central Asian states too, with Tajikistan, where they also speak, as I understand it, a form of Persian? Is this something that people in Iran are talking about? Because again, if you look at the geography, it seems to me that the advantages of this are very obvious and very clear.
Yes, I think that, again, the current administration, because of its differing worldview than the previous administration, or at least the two presidents are different. I don't think everyone in the previous administration had identical views to the president. I don't think that's what I think the previous foreign minister, Dr. Zarif, and President Rouhani were not of the same view. So I'll just say the two presidents. I think the difference between President Raisi and President Rouhani automatically made Central Asia a much higher priority for Iran. And when Iran went to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it was actually in Samarkand. And I did accompany the delegation. And it was clear that the two presidents, when they met before the meeting of the heads of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that they were both keen on pushing relations to a new level. And with the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, that makes a lot of sense because these countries are between Iran and China. But also the North-South corridor part of it runs to the east of the Caspian Sea. So to the west of the Caspian Sea, it runs through Azerbaijan. It also runs through the Caspian Sea from a Russian port to an Iranian port. But also it runs through the east, where it goes through Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. So Central Asia is very important for Iran's policy of South-South cooperation, Asian integration, but also what President Raisi is pushing for of close neighborly ties. So it has changed. I think Turkey's influence in Central Asia is limited because the language isn't the same. They have their own languages. Some do speak Persian. Some speak a type of Turkish, which is not the same as Istanbul. Actually, in Uzbekistan, the Turkish language is much closer to our Azeri language. My family name Marandi is means from Marand. Marand is an Azeri city in Iran. So in many ways, that the Iran is both linguistically, but definitely geographically much more adequately located for improving economic ties, for expanding these ties. And I think that this is something that is happening. Turkmenistan has huge gas resources, and the Iranians and the Russians want to create a sort of triangle between these countries so that they can work together on the gas market, and then maybe with also Qatar later on, although Qatar is a bit different. But there is a lot going on. And since Russia is now sanctioned and Iran is sanctioned, the incentive for Central Asian countries to work with Iran is greater, because these alternative means of business is no longer something that has to do with Iran and Central Asia. It's also Central Asia and Russia. And as I said, the same, just like in the case of China, where they're starting to rethink how to do business to protect themselves from Western sanctions or financial institutions or SWIFT and so on. This is also happening with all of Iran's partners, especially those partners that have a lot of business to do with both Iran and Russia. So things are changing fast, but there's still a very long way to go. I think Iran has not been successful in developing trade relations in the past. Iran has a very big bureaucracy, a very burdensome. It creates a burden, I think, often, and prevents investment and trade. But that is changing. That is gradually changing. We are seeing serious Chinese investors coming to the country. We are seeing tariffs, as at the beginning of the program, I think Glenn alluded to. Tariffs are going to fall for many of the goods between Iran and Russia, Armenia, and other countries in Central Asia. So things are changing. It's not as fast as I would like, but things are changing pretty fast. And again, a lot of this has to do with the stupidity of the policies of the United States and Europe. If I would be able to name the number one reason why all these changes are taking place, I would say it is the policies of the United States.
Bureaucratization in economies is often a consequence of the fact that economies are under intense external pressure.
Yes,
it means that the government has to control the economies, and that causes them to develop bureaucracies in order to do this. So if trade opens up, bureaucratization sometimes ends. Can I just ask you to talk a bit about Iran's economy itself? Because a lot of people, I think, are not familiar with realities about Iran. You mentioned the fact that if people come to Iran, they're struck by what an advanced and modern country it is. Now, I've never been to Iran myself, but I've actually had many discussions with many people who have done, Westerners, and they have all made precisely that observation to me, that it is, in fact, it's got a very significant industrial base, in fact, an expanding industrial base. It produces a large variety of products. It's potentially agriculturally very rich. What it has lacked is not expertise and infrastructure and those kind of things. It's lacked investment more than anything else. But could you perhaps speak to that a bit?
Yes. First of all, what you said about bureaucracy is absolutely correct. Iran, especially in the 1980s, had to expand the bureaucracy. Often, it's not only because when you're under pressure, when countries are under pressure, they have to have a bit bigger bureaucracy and more control, but also you hire people who under, who don't have jobs. And during wartime and during economic difficulties, if people don't have jobs, that becomes a problem in itself. So the sanctions and the war that we had in the 1980s, these helped expand the bureaucracy. But that is changing. Recently there were over the past year, I would say, there are a number of quite a few serious businesses coming from China to Iran to invest, and the reason is that they have been saying that there hasn't been investment in Iran for a decade. And so there are many more opportunities in Iran than other parts of the world. And Iran has a highly educated youth. It's strategically located, and it has enormous underground wealth. And the price of energy in Iran, natural gas and gasoline, is very low. So it's very good for businesses. Gasoline for ordinary Iranians is like 3 cents, 4 cents, like a liter, which I think would, be something that just people in Europe at least cannot even comprehend. So these do create enormous opportunities for these investors, and so we are seeing this change. I think that if things continue as they are, within the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see a lot of investment in Iran. But there's always been this fear. I mean, just as an anecdote, I recall once I invited two professors to come to the University of Tehran for a program we had, and one was from uh, a university in New York, and he brought a big, uh, very heavy suitcase, and I the university driver who took him to his place of stay told me that I couldn't even lift the suitcase. And then when I met him the next day, I said, "By the way, why was your suitcase so heavy?" And he said he was sort of embarrassed, and he said it's like full of canned food. And I said, I asked him, "Why did you bring canned food?" And he said, "Well, I wasn't sure if there was food." So, well, if you go to a supermarket in Tehran, it's very much like a supermarket in Moscow or in London or in Paris. There's everything there. But, often or when the war in Gaza began, actually, I was invited to a dinner where there were a number of uh, Chinese uh, influential Chinese academics and Chinese people close to the government. And they invited me to a dinner, and during the dinner, someone called from Beijing and spoke to one of the Chinese friends at the table and said, "You should come back immediately. There's a war in Iran," because they thought that if since there's fighting in Gaza, that somehow there's fighting in Tehran. So the image that has been created over the last 4 decades, or the securitization of Iran in the West, has created this fear. But those walls are crumbling too, because the world is changing so fast. And I think the credibility of Western media is also dented, to say the least. I mean, it's far more than that. And now countries have their own media. It's not like when I was young and it was Reuters and Associated Press and later on CNN or the BBC where people got their information. Russia has its own media networks. It has its own, online. You have all sorts of people in Russia, in China. There are all sorts of alternative media um, that are interested in our region and that have their own perspective. So I think attitudes towards Iran have changed a lot, and that if they hadn't changed, these investors wouldn't have come to Iran in the first place. I think the very fact that these private investors are coming to Iran shows that these attitudes are changing. And again, we don't know what is going to happen in future, the war in Gaza could expand. The Netanyahu may do something foolish alongside the border in with Lebanon. But as things stand, I think that there are lots of opportunities that that the Iranians are going to be able to benefit from in the coming months and years.
On the topic of on the topic of war, though, is there any way? Do you see any possible scenario in which Iran would be pulled into a wider regional war, either in Syria, or if the war would escalate currently, in Gaza, or I know in the United States the rhetoric is, they assume that Iran is the big puppet master pulling all the strings between, but also, possibly Yemen. I mean, do you see any path in which this could actually spread, or is this, do you see it as being contained, all of these different conflicts?
Well, I know you know this, but I just want to repeat this for your audience, that I am not a member. I do not play a role in the Iranian government. My views are my own. But I think it's very obvious that Iran fully supports the resistance in Gaza. Iran supports Hamas. Iran supports the other groups, Islamic Jihad. And I think it's quite clear that the capabilities of the Palestinians to defend themselves, that they have to do with Iran, and Iran will continue to support them. I think the Iranians they're proud of that. And as we speak, the Iranians will continue to support them. The Iranians, before the revolution itself, and during the years where there was resistance in Iran against the Shah, two key foreign policy issues for the revolutionaries, including Ayatollah Khomeini and his people especially, were apartheid South Africa and Palestine. These were issues that were key before the revolution and key criticisms directed towards the Shah with regards to foreign policy before the revolution. So, and of course, Iran broke off ties both with Israel and with apartheid South Africa after the revolution. And after the collapse of the apartheid regime in South Africa, Iran established ties with that country and has very good ties with it. But so Iran's support for Palestine is not new, and but I don't think that, as things stand, any of the major players have a vested interest in expanding the war. Israel, of course, Netanyahu would like to expand the war, but I don't think anyone who's a decision maker in Washington wants the war to expand. Because let's imagine that it does expand. The more intense the fighting becomes, the more chances are for further developments and events that could trigger even a further expansion of the war. So let's say somehow the Americans strike Iranian targets somewhere for some reason. That would change everything altogether, because Iran would strike back. And those countries in the region, which Iran has good relations with, they host American bases. And so if the Americans attack Iran, then those countries will be seen as hosting a hostile entity. And that could lead to the destruction of their infrastructure, which would mean that there would be no more oil and gas coming from the Persian Gulf region. And I think Iran's drone and missile capabilities, and especially the fact that Iran has been preparing itself for some sort of confrontation with the United States for decades, means that there is a balance of terror. In other words, sort of like between the United States and the Soviet Union before, where there's a balance of terror, where both could destroy one another. Therefore, it made them smart enough not to do anything really stupid. I think there is a sort of balance of terror now between Iran and the United States, where both sides know that a war would be catastrophic. So both sides have a vested interest in containing the violence, but of course, Iran will continue to support Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and others because Iran believes them to be legitimate resistance organizations. Remember, Hezbollah was actually, I know you know this, but I'm just saying this for some in your audience who may not know, although I know your audience is very politically aware. But Hezbollah was created during the Israeli occupation of Lebanon when they took the capital, Beirut. So it was a national resistance organization which ultimately expelled the Israeli regime from almost all of Lebanon. I say almost all of Lebanon because there's a small piece of Lebanese territory that's still occupied by the Israelis. And the same is true with Ansarullah, or in the case of Iraq, Iran's, again, this is, it's really extraordinary what American and NATO policy has done. Iran and Iraq fought 8 years of war. I was a volunteer in that war. I've been shot, I have shrapnel wounds, and I was injured twice with chemical weapons that were given to Saddam by the West. They gave him also the military intelligence to use those weapons and the political cover to get away with it. But that aside, so Iran and Iraq never had really good relations. When the Americans invaded Iraq, that relationship evolved and it became much better, something detrimental to US policy. But when the West began the dirty war in Syria, and then ISIS spilled over into Iraq, and Iraq was about to collapse, the Iranians and the Iraqis fought together against ISIS. And that changed the relationship completely between the two countries because their blood was spilt together against this, So we were fighting before, thanks to Saddam and his allies, but now they were fighting alongside one another. So the relationship between Iran and Iraq is a very different relationship today than ever before. And therefore, I think that the West recognizes, the United States recognizes that war with Iran or conflict with Iran would ultimately lead to the expulsion of the United States from West Asia. But it would come at a horrific price for the international community and for everyone. So Iran doesn't want war. The United States doesn't want war. But Iran will continue to support Palestine, and the United States will continue to support Israel.
Thank you for that, and that very good explanation. Can I just ask, because of course we've been discussing about the economic links, the trading links that are now developing, the fact that the walls have now coming down, that Iran is now finding its way economically in ways that it has not been able to do before. But of course, for all this to develop, one would need a certain security that there would be a long-term peace in the Middle East, peace in the regions. Now, there's this crisis in Gaza at the moment. There's this urgent push in the United Nations in which Iran is fully involved, by the way. The Iranians have been very clear about what they want. They want to see a ceasefire in Gaza. Most of the international community agrees. It is the United States that is isolated at this present time on this issue, not Iran. There's also, I think, a widespread sense around the world that American diplomacy has not been successful, to put it mildly, in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And we're starting to hear increasingly people talking about a peace conference, an international conference bringing together many players to see a way towards a long-term, sustainable, just solution of this conflict. Do you think this is something that Iran might be interested in and might support? I mean, it's a big question that I just thought I may put it.
Well, I'm really sorry for all my long answers. This one is going to be a bit long, and I'm not very charismatic, so I hope I don't bore your listeners, and
Yeah.
I hope it doesn't reflect poorly on your show for having a boring guest. But I think if we look at the South Africa, uh, the Iranian position on South Africa, I think we can learn a lot from that. The Iranians believe that apartheid in South Africa has to end, but Iran didn't believe that white South Africans have to leave, or that white South Africans should be punished. The Iranians believe that there should be rapprochement, and that South Africa should be South Africa for all South Africans. The belief in Iran when it comes to Palestine and the conflict there is the same. Iran doesn't believe that, first of all, a two-state solution is possible, because the West Bank has been so deeply colonized, and by the most hard line of Zionists, that it's not an option. They're not going to leave. Like, I think there are like 700,000 of them right now, and they are really hardcore anti-Arab Zionists. So the two-state solution, as things stand, is not really an option. But also, even if it were an option, hypothetically speaking, for the Iranians, there are two questions that would remain. And that is that what happens to the millions of Palestinians who are in refugee camps, not the refugee camps in Gaza, because as you know, 70% of the Palestinians in Gaza are actually people who were expelled from their homes in the rest of Palestine. They were ethnically cleansed and they had to go to Gaza. But I mean the refugees that are in Lebanon. I've been to the refugee camps in Syria. Again, I've been to a very huge refugee camp in Syria, and of course in Jordan, and there's the Palestinian diaspora. Their right of return is not something that can be, morally speaking, ignored. And also there's the issue of equal rights for those Palestinians who've, for whatever reason, agreed to acquire Israeli citizenship. They are not, I mean, former President Jimmy Carter, when he wrote his book on apartheid in Palestine, his focus was actually on, if I recall, I didn't read the whole book, but if I recall, his focus was actually on the Palestinians. A lot of the focus of the book was on Palestinians inside the 1967 borders. So there are lots of issues at play, but to make it easier, or let me say, to respond to questions that I'm sure many have, because many people in the West, they think that in Iran they're executing people on the street corners, and they're and I don't know, gays are being executed, and the Jews are being in Iran. In Tehran, we have. I've never seen an execution before, by the way, anywhere in Iran. But this is all narrative, Western narratives. But in Iran, in Tehran, we have restaurants that are kosher. We have synagogues. We have a Jewish population that exists in many of Iran's cities. And we have a Jewish MP. In fact, according to the Iranian constitution, there must be a Jewish MP in parliament. So if there's only one Jew in Iran, that Jew will be an MP. And if there are no Jews one day in Iran, they'll have to bring someone to fulfill that role. So Jews have to be in Iranian parliament, just like Christians have to be in the Iranian parliament. By law, they have to be represented, no matter how small their community is. So Iran is not hostile to the Jewish population in Palestine. What it's hostile to is ethno-supremacism, racism, and of course the ethnic cleansing and genocide that is ongoing at a very rapid pace. Not only in Gaza, by the way. What's going on in the West Bank is really, really terrible, especially after October the 7th. But Iran does not seek to expel anyone from Palestine. What Iran wants is to have the whole of Palestine to be an area where Muslims, Christians, and Jews can live together. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow, but I think the Iranians believe that the situation in the region has changed dramatically for Israel. And this is something that I've noticed in China, that Israel is no longer seen as a strong country. The Chinese no longer, for example, see Israel as a high-tech country and a powerful country. They don't see, they're actually quite surprised by its weakness and its inability to even win this battle in Gaza. And I don't think there's going to be any more Chinese investment in Israel. That's at least what the Chinese who I speak to say. And some Israelis are leaving it, but also public opinion has shifted against Israel across the world, and a segment of that population across that we see now speaking out against Israel is actually they're Jews. And I should stress that some of the most heroic figures who are standing up for Palestinian rights and the people of Gaza are Jews, and some of them I'm very proud to be, their friends, personal friends. But in any case, the world has shifted, and while it's impossible to predict the future, I think that it is going to be increasingly difficult for Israel in the years ahead to maintain the status quo. I think it will be impossible. So even though right now the Israeli population is totally against, they're actually very much pro-genocide from what we are hearing in the polls. But I think that the situation in the region and the world is changing. The West is declining pretty rapidly. The world is turning against the Israeli regime. Many Jews across the world are playing a heroic role in opposing apartheid and opposing genocide. I think the years ahead will force change upon the regime. And hopefully, at the moment, I don't see the future. It's dark, and today it's very dark, what we're seeing today. But I'm optimistic that ultimately our region will see peace.
Professor Marandi, we have many more things to discuss and say, but I'm afraid time calls for me, and I'm sorry to finish, but this is a good place in some ways to finish, because the dark often comes before the dawn, as people often say, especially in the Middle East. And as you correctly said, this is indisputably true. The world is changing, and the world is changing in ways faster than anybody expected. And one point I should say, I would actually like to push back on a little, because you spoke about Iran, or the changes around Iran having benefited from changes that have happened around the world. But one mustn't underestimate as well the role that the Iranians themselves have played, the fact that they've done their outreach, that they've conducted their diplomacy, that they've met and spoken with the Russians, they've met and spoken with the Chinese, they've been active in all sorts of places, putting their case. And I think that Iran has a significant role to play in the future, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in Eurasia, and in other things. And no doubt we'll be talking about all those things again. So on my part, I just have to say, I have to go, and I have to say thank you for your wonderful program.
Thank you, Alexander. I agree completely. I think that Iran has capitalized very cleverly when it comes to the mistakes made by a far more powerful United States. It's sort of a battle between David and Goliath. So Iran, yes, they did play their cards very well, and let's see how things play in the months and years ahead.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thanks again for your time. And just like to say, I agree. I think the world is transforming very quickly, and to fully appreciate it, one has to have a close eye at Iran as well. So thank you again for being so generous with your time.
Thank you, Glenn.